So I guess we shall continue. I hope we're all sitting comfortably, have some kind of warm drink. And yeah, we shall continue with Sturly by Pierre Custot. 18. For 3 days the anger of the waters had increased. The sea rocked its swell as a giant his shoulders before striking. It showed teeth white with foam in a feline snarl. The waves were heavy, and the whole weight of the waters seemed to crush the earth. The wind galloped like a general, urging the waves to battle. In the sky the clouds collapsed clamorously. Petrels and kittiwakes at first had been screaming with joy, but now they fled from the storm on wings as heavy as iron. The sea was passing through a crisis of murderousness and madness, struck the reefs on the coast with all the strength of its fist with its cestus of blue metal, and twisted the foaming waves like locks of hair. Sturly was gambolling on the surface when he noticed a large liner running before the storm. He was startled by it. Old Equinus had spoken to him of the creatures which inhabit the land, and had explained as well as he could what a ship is. He had sometimes met with a wreckage at the bottom of the sea. He had even seen at a distance the packet boat which takes the mail between France and Corsica, so he followed it mechanically, keeping contact. The coast seemed to fly away, in soft tints of fresh colour wash which have been accidentally smeared by one's sleeve. The great ship battled. The tips of its masts traced large crosses in the sky. The cable hammock of its wireless hissed, was luminous, sending its call of distress to the four corners of space. Its enormous funnels were white with salt, all its portals closed, the deck deserted. It panted in this ferocious struggle, leaping, rearing, at intervals showing the red colour of its flayed belly. At times the screws whirled madly in the air. Mountains of water tossed up the enormous ship like a plank and slid under it as it found itself in a chasm. Lumps of sea attacked it sideways, charging on it like wild bulls, and its whole hull groaned horribly. In the mahogany saloon, where swang Pullman armchairs and copper light stands swayed mounted on swivels, mournful human beings were gathered in one corner. A child was crying, but its voice was lost in the din. At intervals, the infernal clamour stopped short, and nothing could be heard but the water rushing through the scuppers. The waters seemed stilled forever, and the great steamer was like a resting wreck. But the infernal clatter began again with redoubled violence, and the battle was extended. The horizon was like a vast grey sheet, where sky and sea melted into each other, and the mist streamed past like immense gauze decorations painted at different levels. The long mail boat struggled, attempted a heavy gallop, stumbled, halted, trembling in its deepest fibres, snorted, breathless, exhausted. Sturly began to see strange things floating on the water, moving very rapidly in the disaster. Buoys, painted planks, barrels, and even a drowned corpse with a swollen jacket, whose hands were as white as a fish's belly. On the bridge was the captain, his beard drenched, his eyes smarting with salt. And the agony of the ship began. It was the end, the death of the quarry. The waves came in howling packs from all points of the horizon. First they smashed in the deck cabins, tore off the chests moored to the streaming deck, flattened the lifeboats. The large flag which streamed behind was torn with a noise like calico. Now the broken hatchways let in torrents of water, heavy as metal. Then suddenly the immense ship ceased to roll and turned on its side like a vanquished athlete who was dying. The starboard rails were already in the foaming water, and the men clambered in disorder up the slippery deck to reach the other side, in which now could be seen all the rows of portholes one above the other. But the stern seemed to rise up. The boat dived head foremost and sank into the sea as into the folds of a shroud. The air expelled by the water formed enormous eddies, and Sturly saw numbers of black cross-shaped figures which struggled as they sank lower and lower. Its object attained, the storm now grew calmer. The thinning clouds allowed a sight of the blue of the heavens, and the quantities of wreckage floating here and there ceased to be tossed about. For a long time a white dog swam. Passing Bonito snapped at its paws and went off with a hypocritical air. Its stroke achieved, the storm had fled. The sea now purred and licked itself like a resting tiger. 19. Many small fry rose to the surface in a busy way. What had happened? Were the things that had gone to the bottom good to eat? The codfish fled in terror, and Sturly waited in expectation. Enormous pilgrims came up, sharks which went by in Indian file, sniffing the water, going like blind men, for it was still daylight and they only see by night. An inexpressible sense guided them. They were made for speed with their pectoral fins and their scythe-shaped tails. At intervals they turned upwards, showing their bellies which seemed powdered with aluminium. And soon, here and there, were red patches and a smell of blood. 20. While the voracious sharks were feeding, Sturly kept away, avoiding any quarrel with these pirates. But the 5th day he approached the wreck. The air which remained in its hull gurgled like the belly of a corpse filled with gases, and sometimes there rose from it very large wobbling bubbles of air. A sea perch with spectacled eyes and blue lips sculled with its tail, hesitated, then shot like a bullet through one porthole and out another. The corpses are covered with ooze, that ash-grey, musk-smelling ooze of the great deeps. A cuttlefish lifts a woman's skirts. A contorted and crook-kneed crab tries to disengage a claw which it has thrust into an eye. A medusa has settled on a beard like a lump of spit. Sturly remained there some time. He thought, why live if one must die? Then he thought of his dear mission and set out again on his way. 21. The sea was always singing, and its rhythm was never the same. It had been an orchestra let loose, a tragic singing striped with bass viols, in which angers trumpeted, through which rushed lightning-like clashes of cymbals over the rolling thunder of the drums. Now it was a very simple song, pure as the untrained voice of a young woman singing her child asleep. The swell rose as softly as the belly of a girl asleep. The seabirds passing by in the heavens were as white in the sun as the eternal snows, and the flying fishes, darting like javelins, seemed to ricochet and to dip the ends of their wings in fire. Sturly knew all the winds of the sea, cyclones, typhoons, squalls, Etesian winds, Mistral, Lebeccio, Bora, Sirocco, monsoons of Guinea, Australia and the Indian Ocean, trade winds and counter-trade winds. He knew the currents of the Indian Ocean, of Brazil and the Humboldt Current, the Gulf Stream and the Kurosiwo. He swam in the dead waters of the tropics, knew the equatorial countercurrents, the terrible races, the race of Blanchard, of Fromveur, the Great Terror, of defeat and of the dead, the whirlpool of Charybdis and Scylla, the maelstrom of the Lofoden Islands, the whirlpool of Corryvecion in the Hebrides. He was jostled by the Marobio of Sicily, that monstrous wave of blood which seems to engulf the world. Everywhere Sturly anxiously sought information. Unwearyingly he questioned everything that lives in the sea. He even asked the opinion of tiny larvae. He even made inquiries of the glaucus. A sturgeon of his size speak to this tiny creature which walks under the surface of the water like a fly underneath a horizontal mirror? He even questioned the halobates, an insect which skates over the swell and jumps like a flea. The Glaucus atlanticus, blue belly and white back, spoke in such a distant little voice it seemed miles away. I have heard it said that a god inhabits the palace of waters in the warm grottos. I know, said the halobates, that this palace, he took a jump, is in a submerged town. I shall ask, thought Sturly, the tunnies and flounders who go everywhere. For long hours he followed a group of dugongs, who had women's breasts, a monkey's head, and greasy hair. But they were obtuse persons, who thought of nothing but showing off fine manners, and were of mean intelligence. He could get nothing but vague expressions from them. We did once hear of this palace of which Halicor is king. It is in a town built by men and now submerged by the sea, in the Gulf of Karabogas, on the edge of the Caspian, where 50,000 tons of salt are deposited every day. No, said another, it is at Is or at Talente at the bottom of the Ava Rach, perhaps at Nazaro near Eguay, or Gadouan in the Bay of Dol. But the flounders gave him different directions. It was Helbert who was king of the sea. He lived in a buried forest at Cromel, unless it is in the forest of the Texel where the Dutch fishermen still tear their nets. But when he questioned the tunnies, they burst out laughing. But it was Tinnus who governed the empire of the seas. His palace was to be sought for among the prodigious efflorescence of Madrepora, or the Gulf of Madrepora of the Gulf of Mexico. This castle, defended by coral reefs, was at the bottom of a mysterious lagoon, among fungia, meidrina, tritones, tridacinae, moored by their threads of byssus, looking like holy water stoups presenting their contents to the heavens as an offering. 22. At evening, when the waters took on a pearl-grey tint, Sturly meditated. All these creatures are shells filled with vanity. According to them, Topane is a dugong, a tunny, a flounder. They send me to right and left like a piece of wreckage drifted by the waves. The pride of creatures is immeasurable. A Venus's flower basket came by. It was a sort of horn of abundance in glass lace of unheard-of delicacy. Phosphorescences, hundreds of millions of luminous bacteria, suddenly lighted up. My soul, thought Sturly, is plunged in ignorance. And his heart was sad. Oh, Father Echinus, why have you abandoned me, lost in the midst of my search? A smell of iodine and bromine brought him out of his meditation. There, half unrolled like an arum lily, held to the bottom by mother-of-pearl and rose-coloured stalks, was a little seaweed among other red, ragged, enormous-leafed weeds. Maya, the crab, who is like a spiny spider, Maya, who plants seaweeds on her back with her claws to hide better from her enemies, was vainly trying to turn over a large mauve-coloured sea urchin. Phronima, a tiny crustacean, was laughing. Phronima's head is heavy, and she is forced to walk with her head down. Then she attacks a Beroe, cuts off one end and makes herself a keg of gelatine on which she sits in a cramped position, keeping 2 legs by way of oars. Sturly killed Fromina with a blow of his tail and crushed the crafty Maya with one crunch of his teeth, and the dear voice of old Echeneus was heard. "Wanderer, wanderer, you are here then, son of my heart. It gives me exquisite joy to hear you, father, but I am Sturly." Echeneus chuckled like the squeaking of a pulley. "Errant, you are the knight-errant. You seek adventures among the waters of the vast world, and your soul is errant too. Will you not help me in my search, father?" The voice of old Echeneus became rather like that of a village schoolmaster in his dotage who intones his lesson. "It was in the sea that life came to birth. It is in the sea that the meaning of life must be sought." "Oh, speak," said Sturly anxiously. But the ancestor of ancestors recited very rapidly, "Salt water enters the composition of protoplasm in the proportion of 80%. And he burst out laughing. And as Sturly sighed, he added, seriously this time, "Come now, I am with you, but we obtain nothing here below without effort. Go and look at the stones of the tombs submerged at the bottom of the port of Corinth, the temples under the waters of the Bay of Samos, the sediments on the shores of Delos. There you will find creatures such as you have never seen. They are enormous dugongs with no hair who continually ruminate. They are the manatees. Follow them." 23. A group of these manatees from the estuary of the Orinoco were just leaving when Sturly arrived exhausted near Delos. Nothing could seem less definite than the course they followed, yet they never left the coast and spent hours in browsing on the bulbous sea wrack. Sturly watched them with admirable patience. Sometimes he rose to the surface and hunted on his own account. He met the mola, that moonfish which the fisherman can see swimming along by its pectoral fin, and which can easily be harpooned, so great is its stupidity. It was not worth snapping at. Its balloon-shaped body is so rotten with parasites. Sturly, who despised no one, spoke to it of his palace, of his search. The mola looked at him with its marble-like eye, and spoke thus, expressing itself slowly and in a fluty voice. "I would not say anything against old Echeneus. He is as round as I am," it bridled, "all proportions observed, but I think he is imposing upon you. For my part, and thank God I claim to be no fool, for my part I have never heard of old King Gralon, of the King of Ys. But I especially pride myself on being a good judge of prudence. I have it from certain of my friends, an oyster-catcher and a peewit, that at a low spring tide the submerged town can be seen. Men have declared war on us ever since the sun has been on fire, and you will perceive the danger of such an expedition." So saying, he let loose a string of stinking bubbles. He excused himself with an extreme politeness. The undesirables with which his body was stuffed played these tricks upon him. To come back to old Echeneus, he added that the sea urchin annoyed him with his chuckles. Sturly sided with the old sage, and mortified the mola extremely by saying, "That's enough! Shut up, Moonface!" Then he hastened to rejoin his flock of manatees. They were wallowing among the sea grasses and stuffing themselves with verdure. Then gravely rising on their flat tails, they advanced, dancing like marionettes on the end of a thread. And thus, one evening, after 6 interminable months, they began to halt and hold councils. They chose an amphitheatre of reefs and placed scouts. Sturly did not wait for them. It was there that in 1883, during the formidable eruption of Krakatoa, half the island collapsed under the sea more than 1,000 yards deep, near the Sunda Islands in the Pacific. Beneath the mud which rounded angles and made everything uniform could be seen houses, streets, squares. All the trees spread their bare boughs in the water, twined with seaweeds like serpents. Over the tops of this foliage passed strings of fish, an agave blue with saffron-coloured eyes, and other longer fish, scimitar-shaped, looking as if sheathed in violet satin sprinkled with red pepper. But a little farther on, as far as eye could see, rose immense twisted columns like those of a gigantic temple, enormous cables of byssus like twisted beige silk. At the summit it looked like hoisting tackle with ravelled strands of rope anchored to immense bivalve shells, like holy water vessels, the tridacanae. There were some as large as fountain basins, and Sturly swam round their serratures. But the light of heaven only illuminated the foliated limestone of their dome-shaped shells, which in places were polished by the sea like stone worn beneath the tread of men. Was this the empire of Mother of Pearl, the kingdom of love about which old Echenos had spoken to him so often? He felt a painful disappointment, and yet he felt happy, for Echenos had said to him, "The kingdom of Mother of Pearl is the antechamber of the palace of Topane." He thought, "It is with this as with all unknown things which the mind has dressed in the woven silk of dreams." All the same, he did not succeed in consoling himself. The light was fading, and he felt a profound discouragement within him. He almost came to doubt his search. Was that love? Silence enveloping closed rooms in which no doubt only a kind of sexual struggle took place? Was it only a necessity, willed by nature for her perpetuation? The individual counted for nothing and everything was purely material? Thinking thus, he went down again to the sea bottom. Besides a single thin tuft of seaweed, a green leather bag from which came laces punctured with eyelets, was a little brown fish, the goby. A goby in these surroundings, thought Sturly. That is strange. Sand goby, he added. Don't be afraid, my boy. The goby had placed its nest beneath a turned-down empty shell, and he was covering it with sand with his fins. For convenience, he had fixed himself on a point of rock with the sucker that he carries under his belly. All the inhabitants of the sea know that once the goby has deposited his eggs in their nest, he defends them with furious heroism. He has no special weapon except his resolution to die rather than yield. So the bonitos who passed near turned off sideways after a wry glance, impressed in spite of themselves, and saying, "We must respect courage. Yes, there is no lack of prey, unnecessary to have to deal with this wild creature." Sand goby, you please me. There is nothing in love then but the act itself, said Sturly. Then sadly he ended up, "Come, another instinct willed by nature for the preservation of the species. Oh God, everything then is merely matter. I wish my soul could escape from my body as the lobster does from his shell. Everywhere I strike matter." And he cried twice, very loudly, "Topane, Topane," in a tone of unspeakable despair. At that very moment, the pale glimmer which soaked the waters went out. 24. And at dawn God lifted the drapery of the darkness like a fairy scene. There was a music of harps, divine as that which must be played in heaven by the fair-haired archangels seated on the hem of the clouds. With one movement all the trichinae opened like lids, and the waters were illuminated with a rosy light. Sturly felt weightless, and with a light bound reached conches and tritones. He felt intoxicated with the happiness of living, and approached a monstrous shell, serrated like the holy water stoops of cathedrals. Inside it was a palace of mother of pearl, glittering with millions of lights. "Wanderer, my Sturly!" cried a voice, which this time seemed young and clear. "Is it you, father?" replied Sturly, whose heart beat wildly. "Have I not found the meaning of life at last? Is it not love?" The sea urchin remained invisible, but his voice was as sonorous as a wave. "Look, they are two and they are one. The act does not suffice them, and they magnify it. In the adorable trances of love they create that light and that song, that aggregate of vibrations which reaches even to the heart of God. To love is to draw near. It is the supreme foretaste of survival. Did I not tell you, Sturly, that it was in the antechamber of the palace of Topane? They are themselves the universe, and their heart is a sun without spots. Sturly, bend down, smell the gusts of perfume which rise from the censers. Reflect, why would he have invented beauty if it were not to deck love with it? In the Niger, which is edged with the gigantic trunks of mahogany trees, with silk cotton trees, with ebony trees and with citrus trees, the citron-coloured velvet fish love. In the dark sea, where the blue crystals of the polar ice dip down, and where the aquatic creatures wear fur, there, too, love reigns. Everywhere. In the centre of the desert oceans, or on the edges of the continents where the hand of man has set torches, it is by love that God communicates with us. And the voice rose for the last time with a marvellous sweetness and purity. Farewell, Sturly. I have spoken from the tenderness of my heart. Remember. And once more the mother-of-pearl shells were bathed in moonlight reflections, and the grand hymn to love and life swelled up and seemed to enchant the vast world. 25. Once again the day, after having run all round the globe, came back, shaking its mantle of light, then disappeared again with a bound, and night once more dressed the earth and the waters in mourning. Sturly let himself sink and slept. He slept like all fishes, with open eyes, resting on the ground, poised on his fins, immobile as a bronze statue. Only the imperceptible undulating movement of his tail and the beating of his gills showed that he was alive. His sleep habitually was infinitely light, and when he dreamed, except at the time of love, it was only in snatches and only of hunting and carnage. But this evening he seemed as inert as a rock. He was conscious of prodigious things. Old Echinus spoke. "Do you know death, you who seek the meaning of life? The corpses which rot in wrecks at the bottom of the sea have still on their bones a little spare flesh which smells of bad meat. Death had nothing, but she was immense. It was she who ploughed the sea with her scythe and splashed sheaves from it, while with her feet she killed everything that lives in the ocean. In the deepest part of the ocean the waters only reach her height. But Echinus said she swims, Her bones made the sea smoke like heated irons, and the ocean rushes in, thundering in its orbits. She sits invisible on the stern of a steamer and makes it sink. The ships which pass between her legs go down. She hurls her scythe like a boomerang. The scythe flies, goes round the world, kills thousands of living beings and returns to her hand. Only the soul has God forbidden her to touch. If she sees one rising up to heaven, brushing against her as it passes, she is shaken with a terrible shuddering. With a gasp, her jawbones fall out of the joint, her finger bones are scattered like a broken rosary. The bones of her pelvis, which resemble stone ears, separate as if the brass wire holding them together were broken. Her thigh bones leave their sockets, and her carcass falls apart. She seems to be in the death agony without being able to die. Sturly said, "And the soul?" Echinus made no reply, and the whole vision seemed to disappear in a smoky chaos. Then he felt a confused sensation, a dreadful agony. It seemed to Sturly during his sleep, which was like death, that his soul was detached from his body. It rose like a bubble and burst at the surface. Then it diminished and became a luminous point like that which spurts between the two carbons of an arc lamp. It rose so quickly that it entered the Milky Way and mingled with the stars. It shone. It was dispersed through the great all. There is no psychic phenomenon without a physical realization, and no physical reality without a psychic impulse. Matter was not inert. An ion represented a localized, infinitesimal universe. What was the essence of this granular physical energy, of this force sufficient to realize the universe? Nothingness had never existed, would never exist, and the necessity of the being to be and of duration sprang from this infallibly. That was the meaning of life, of eternal life. 26. He lived now like a brute asleep in those equatorial seas with their languid swells, their loins heavy with life, and eternally drowsing under their stormy clouds. Those warm waters cradled his nonchalance as a Creole is cradled in a hammock of blue silk. 27. Sturly awoke from a heavy sleep. His head felt heavy, the least light dazzled him, and he had to make painful efforts to swim and to seek his daily food. He remembered nothing, and the ideas which passed through his brain went through it joined to one another, evoked by the ordinary spectacle of his life. He thought, here are wrasses asleep with their heads down in the corals. A cuttlefish has closed the hole in this rock with its membrane, and its whiplash arm is trying to dislodge a green crab so that it will run into the snare where a horny beak will tear it to shreds. He saw marinas in their robes, oscillated and specked with gold. An immense ray passed with arabesques and designs embossed on a skin white as the pulp of a citrus fruit. With a movement of the loins he leaped forward and bit it in the shoulder. The ray tried vainly to pierce Sturly's armour with the point of its whip-like tail. The supple marinas made off, laughing with their ferocious little muzzles, awaiting their part of the feast. He tore it apart with savage joy. There were some brown sea urchins there, but Sturly did not even think about them, and they did not speak any longer. Sturly visited many seas, green, blue, black, or yellow waters. At that period his brothers were going towards the Loire, the Rhône, the Garonne, the Danube, the Volga. One morning at dawn, a shoal of salmon passed, led by a sturgeon. "Crick!" called Sturly, and he swam quickly to catch up with him. Then Criac shouted, without slackening his speed, "Follow us, Sturly of the Hausen. We are going northward. It is the time of weddings." Then Sturly awoke, shook off his torpor. He felt in himself something gay, active and creative. A flame of savage, heroic love passed over him, and his whole being seemed to burn. And I think we shall take an early break there, and we shall return in a moment. There is indeed a lot happening here. For a story about a fish, it's getting pretty philosophical. But yes, go do break-related things, and we shall see you back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. apologies for the slightly longer break than usual. I realised when I was trying to carry 3 cups of varying descriptions upstairs that I couldn't do that. So I had to make several trips. Because it turns out I don't have 3 hands and tea is hot. But yes, welcome back everybody. I hope we have had... Sam could have helped but he didn't. This is true. Yes, I hope everybody's had a good break and feeling suitably refreshed. Yeah, want to carry on with the weird philosophical fish drama. Don't really know. This is a very strange story. I don't hate it. I kind of love it, but it's very strange. Just a French lad getting obsessive about fish. Seems to happen a lot. But yes. Have I missed anything? Hang on one sec. Thank you very much, Ray Tracer, for gifting a sub to Heartpress. That's very kind of you indeed. Heartpress, enjoy your sub, enjoy your emotes, as I see you are already doing. Salad, I hope you are well. Welcome in. And if I didn't see you earlier, Andy Pants, hello, welcome in. Your phone's down to 6%. Yeah, well, I hope the bus turns up soon. Yeah, have a safe journey. Yeah. See you hopefully soon. But yes, shall we continue? This bit, like, I just did a quick sort of check on this bit. This is all a bit this fish love. Might be a bit weird, so just general disclaimer. It's just fish loving. So see how this goes, shall we? Oh god, I can't do Roman numerals. What are we on? Right, let's continue. 28. She was a fine, muscular and supple female. This happened to the north of Cape St. Vincent over a bed of bright sand where the blue lobsters walked with the precaution of cripples, in a place where there are submarine grottos carpeted with russet seaweeds. There were quite 100 sturgeons, each weighing over 500 pounds, and their powerful swimming disturbed the bronze crabs, the flowering sea anemones, all those strange creatures which are dressed in snow or in lamp black, or are sometimes sausages of bluish gelatine, sometimes wavy volutes. The medusae, like parachutes or irised glass, passed hither and thither, and all swam quickly, forming a round. Sturly, in his place, looked attentively. He recognised Sterlet the pygmy, Acipenser the steer, Hausen. They would soon be leaving for the Caspian Sea. What were they doing there? He saw seahorses attached to branches of seaweed by their tails, which were curled up like notes of interrogation. Strange beasts, since the males were made to carry in their bellies the eggs laid by their females. But he was swimming beside her who would be the mother of his little ones, and he felt transported with an instinctive happiness. She was certainly the most beautiful. The crown pieces of her coat of mail were a fair horn, and in her movements were charming vigour and harmony. Sturly came and went, showed her his best dives, surrounded her in fine circles, as a lasso twines about a quarry without even grazing it. Now that his brain was empty, it was filled drop by drop with love, and he felt an inexpressible delight in feeling himself living near the female of his choice. Of old, when he was alone, the way seemed interminable. Now he felt a constant happiness in showing her the way and in piloting her. But with the males it is a rule not to show their tenderness. Sturly then went in front without appearing to notice her, but found pretext to see whether she were following him. He made it a point of honour not to wait when she stopped to hunt. Only from time to time he slackened his speed and brushed against her in passing, his scales rasping hers roughly. She turned off with a bound, in annoyance. Yet she followed him with a kind of passivity. As for him, he was proud to show her his powerful swimming, and he went forward with a rush, vibrating like a steamer. His tail thrashed the thick water, making soft figures of 8 in vanishing lines, and his straight or incurving fins guided him with precision. At intervals she stopped completely and began to feel the ooze with her barbels. Then he pretended not to be in a hurry himself, and, returning to meet her, he beat up all the flatfish hiding in the mud, and she pounced on them in a confused cloud. And in this way they proceeded, living out the destiny written for them in the great book of tradition, which, at bottom, is only the development of races. They went on, and, as is the custom, his authority grew stronger and stronger. He was the guide, the one who knows and has a cure of souls. He often stopped to test the temperature of the water, to study the difference in its salinity, seeking the entrance to the river where all those of the race of Hausen had been created. Under the waves where man would be almost blind and would distinguish no differences, his instinct was infallible, that crystallized experience of thousands of years which was mysteriously transmitted at birth by pure atavism. There was some personal experience too, but he had very little memory. The degree of memory indicates the evolution of living beings, and his whole acquirement was limited to marking the differences of flora on the fringes of the continental shelf. One evening, swimming became more difficult for them both. They were as if struggling against a current. It was then that the female passed deliberately ahead. They had entered the estuary of a river. Bands of eels were coming down with the current, for, unlike them, they go to lay their eggs in the great marine basins. Those who lived in ponds in the middle of fields, whipped by instinct, undertook a formidable pilgrimage of love among amazing difficulties. Crawling clumsily, wriggling, suffocating, in terror, they had to pass through dewy meadows, through orchards, under the damp birthwort, through pea-sticks, from rillets to rills, until they reached the nearest river, in which they guided silently, without even making a wound on the water as it smoked in the dawn. They were going towards the sea for mysterious rendezvous, whence all would set out like pilgrims towards the very aerated waters of the deeps near the coast of Ireland. There were young viscous ones with opal reflections, green weed-coloured ones, black ones looking as if rubbed with graphite, and dry old ones, strong, knotty, long like vine branches. All followed the same path, waiting in masses in the estuaries and then setting out in bands for those 1,500 yards depths where the temperature is suitable. They came from the rivers of Finland, Russia, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, the Low Countries, all making for the Atlantic. At ordinary times this would have been a splendid feed, but at this period the fish observed a kind of forced truce, and Sturly followed his female without even thinking of catching them for food. They knew it and came towards him without departing one iota from their way. Carried onwards by the current, they passed rapidly. It was also the period when the mullets and the barbels, seeking hiding places for their eggs, emitted a guttural sound without, however, allowing a single bubble to escape their fat lips, and when the water-weeds, torn up by the strong current of the draining time, rose twisting to the surface and made barriers across the supports of bridges. Sturly had forgotten everything about the sea, followed his female with docility, hypnotized by her presence, not even seeking the square-snouted gudgeons, the young pike hidden under the green moss of the stones like a dagger in its sheath, and the carp which looked like reddish-brown metal smeared with gun grease. The mud was as thick as putty, and the stones were embedded in it like almonds in nougat. At first, Sturly, who was used to vast spaces, found difficulty in swimming in these limited waters. But, through God's will, it was impossible for him not to follow his destiny, and he did not leave his female, following her by his extraordinary sense of smell. At bottom he detested these strange waters where there was no tide, these insipid waters where the current glided between the two banks like a marble in a groove. He had to scull the whole time, and make more use of his fins than of his tail. No, Sturly had forgotten his search. He was nothing more than a male like the others, bidden by nature to perpetuate the species. He rarely came to the surface, from an instinct of prudence against the malignant genius of men. He had learned in a rough school. One of his brothers, forgetting the immutable rule imposed upon sturgeons at the marriage season, had leaped upon the mere glitter of a scale, and immediately, caught in the gullet, had been drawn up by a vibrating guitar string, which made a kind of fan of light in the disturbed water. He had struggled, curved like a bow, with sudden relaxations and terrible jerks, in spite of the dreadful pain, with leaps, with contortions, his gills enamelled with blood. Then, stiff, almost immobile, he had felt himself dragged towards the surface, where a javelin, which the reflection of the water divided, was nimbly cast, harpooned him, and dragged him out. He had never been seen again, and Sturly, immobilized a moment by terror, had leapt away in search of his female, who had stopped some 20 fathoms away in the deepest part of the river, beside an enormous tuft of aquatic weeds as fine as asparagus grass. 29. And for long years Sturly hunted, ate, rested, knew love and long journeys, carried along by the wheel of life. His flesh had become more compact, the horn of his scales harder, his jaws stronger, and for a long time he had been a splendid beast, made for love and carnage. But the more he lived, the more his mind had become embedded in mud, the more his search had disappeared into forgetfulness. He lived like all his kin with the motto, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What had he to do now with the dreams of his youth? His kin admired him because he was strong, and his coldness of soul passed for experience and knowledge. The ruffians of the sea were respectful of his strength, and turned out of his path as if they had not seen him. Moreover, he now showed no pity. All was prey to him, and he lived from preference in the opaque waters of the north. "30. He was at the summit of his strength, and then he began to descend the slope on which all that lives here below slides down to destruction. But a time came when he began to feel a stiffness in his joints, when his sense of smell was sometimes at fault, and his barbels had lost their agility. He was out of temper with them, and blamed the age. Prey was much more difficult to seize than of old. Young codfish and hake were more astute than in the good old times. He was less respected. He was no longer the dreaded master of the Newfoundland banks. Some days he really could not understand it. In spite of a more sustained attention, and with all his senses on the alert, he would wrongly calculate his speed, and clap his jaws on nothing, only touching the opaline fringe of a whiting's tail. He thought, something has changed. Everything goes from bad to worse, and the fault is in these cold waters which paralyse me. It is certainly always a great mistake to leave one's own country. In my own waters it will be different. The length of the journey, he could no longer, as of old, follow his route for hours at full speed like a steamer, terrified him. Then he thought, I will go by short stages, There is no hurry. The journey will cheer me up. I was getting rusty here." And he felt quite comforted by this resolve, which was the outcome of his anxiety. But the distance seemed interminable to him, and he multiplied his rests and halts like an old pilgrim. He stopped in front of a tuft of seaweeds, talking to himself. Hey, what is that there?" But he knew within him that there was nothing, and that he was trying to impose on himself. He only wanted to stop for a short rest. His eyes, like those of all fish, were extremely myopic, but had lost some of their acuteness of vision, and his sense of smell was often at fault. Then he was seized with a panic at the sight of a shadow or a rock. He jumped aside and turned his start into a joyous caper, so as not to have to admit to himself that he had been frightened. Then he would swim very rapidly for a few minutes and stop, tired out, which made the terrorized small fry rush away like a handful of arrows. If at this moment a great bandit of the seas had appeared, swimming on his back, with his sickle-shaped mouth and the 5 openings of his ears, he would have let himself be assassinated. One night, in the Gulf of Gascony, his sense of smell warned him of the danger of a band of grampuses and large sharks which were scouring the coasts, all the more to be dreaded since they were on a foray. He had avoided them and was proud of it, but turned off so far that he went too much out to sea, off his track. He found it again, however, and arrived off Cape St. Vincent, where of old he had kept love rendezvous with those of his race. He saw the assembly again, and remembered that he was only there by chance, that on this occasion he had not been urged by instinct. He seemed a stranger, and he was hurt because one of his last females did not recognize him. He pursued others, but none of them seemed to notice his existence. Salmon passed, led by another Kriak. He clenched his jaws with fury and went off at top speed, but he reached the current which sweeps round the peninsula, and he had to slacken speed, out of breath. He stopped several times, with distress in his soul, and felt the mortal pain of growing old. He would have liked someone to pity him, to feel compassion for him, but were not the beasts as ferocious as men? Then, with a bound, he reacted once more. He was truly stupid to distress himself for so little. His imagination was the cause of this. He was not so worn out as that, and, as soon as he got back to his own waters, he would recover a great part of his virility. He was angry all the time now, became pitiless to the weak and the young, thinking he was showing his strength, and he took prey as they came along. In this way, outside the columns of Hercules, he made a great slaughter of rocklings, felt proud of it, and for a time his mind was appeased. 31. At last he came into the blue waters, the blessed waters of his youth, and at first he had a feeling of beatitude. But the memories evoked by these familiar scenes were very confused. First, they were no longer his sapphire waters. They seemed black to him, and a distant grumbling of a storm came from the laden clouds. But it was not a revengeful country, and Sturly thought, "It is grumbling at the prodigal son, but it will smile at him." And, thinking he had regained his strength, he soon reached Mediterranean waters. It was his last joy. There were now so many seaweeds he had difficulty in remembering where he was. Starfish and sea cucumbers seemed larger to him. The light was weaker, and the water certainly colder. There he remained in stupor, thinking of things confusedly, when a stentorious voice made him start with fear. This formidable voice clamoured, "Back! Back! Woe to you if you come near me! I am the Knight of the Sea, the Paladin, the hero, youth and faith, glory and honour to me!" Sturly, seeing the cataphractor, was seized with such shame that he rushed on the wretched little beast in a fury and crushed its head with one snap. Then a voice, which seemed to come from the entrails of the sea, called twice in tones of unspeakable distress, "Wanderer! Wanderer! My Sturly!" And Sturly was seized with a great shuddering and remained there, listening uneasily. But it was only a confused echo, as if coming from the depths of himself. Then he began to go towards the shore in little bounds, stopping to listen, but in vain. 32. With a scraping of bows on the bass vials of the wind in a hasty measure, the storm grumbled. It flew through space with its mantle of clouds dragging behind. Sometimes it kicked columns of foam from the sea, or, gathering the waters in its monstrous arms, dashed the waves together. Groups of fish fled like clusters of bullets before the storm, crying, "Save yourselves! Out to sea!" Sturly turned about, disordered as a ship running on only one propeller. The salt mists and the sand-laden winds lashed the umbrella pines, and the tamarisks seemed convulsed with terror. The storm covered all Europe. Even the sea rushes and blue thistles of Brittany were sandy, and the clovers and fennels of the north coast were champed by the blast. The sea rolled its attack upon the shores like an avalanche, and the piled-up clouds passed over the grey screen of the sky like visions of the apocalypse. Over the bass of an orchestra let loose, in which sounded all the brasses of earth and heaven, a shrill song clamoured, "Wanderer! Wanderer!" But blinded, harried, deafened by the crash of the storm, Sturly did not hear. The muddy water was a whirlpool, and a sort of invincible reflux raked everything towards the coast. A lighter was filled with water like a hollow mussel, and sank in a waddling sort of way. All the filth stirred up from the sea bottom, all the driftwood was gathered together and driven towards the coast. The sea was like a dishevelled gorgon, howling and waving foam-veiled arms to heaven. "Wanderer! Wanderer!" Things were cast up on the streaming pebbles, a piece of iron yellow with rust, a bottle end polished by the wearing of the sand, viscous seaweeds and fragments of shells. The sea rolled them about with a minute ferocity. A lighthouse flashed out, its white glow turned like a sling. It went so far away it appeared lost, then returned at a prodigious speed, only to disappear once more. Sturly, caught in the whirlpools, now struggled with all his energy, but anxiety came upon him when he realized his efforts were in vain. Little by little, he fell into disorder. He felt his strength failing. If he dived to find calmer waters, he struck at once a mud stirred up like the colour of a bottom of a tin. If he came to the surface, it was the unbridled sea in a recrudescence of fury. With her teeth she tore down the concrete blocks of the breakwater and struggled hand to hand with the piles of the jetty. Blinded, stunned, wounded, the enormous beast lost ground, and, seized with panic, made one mistake after another. At moments, Sturly in exhaustion ceased to struggle, and with a bound the sea carried him yet a little nearer the shore. Yet Sturly had one last start of energy, and his defence became splendid. But it was too late, and, as always, the sea was victorious. Soon his tail was torn by a rocky ground, and that was the end. The water rolled him, overbalanced, bleeding, lost towards the shore. And it was thus he was stranded there, at the very moment when an immense cry was raised in a moment of calm. "Wanderer!" That day there were many ships which did not return to port. 33. A wave, curved like a ploughshare, turned up the foam and cast him so far up that now there came only little ripples, thin as window glass, which surrounded him without even covering him. His head rested, wedged between two small rocks, just at the spot where there was a spring, and at each convulsive movement of his tail, his body became sandy. Of old, the light of the sun came to him cooled under the water. Now it burned unendurably, and at every struggle that he made with his tail pressed on the burning sand, it was as if a flame were consuming him alive. With his pointed snout he breathed in a kind of jet of vapour, and his scarlet gills opened and shut. The little water which bathed him revived this hellish torture. The slight splash and song of the spring added to his torment, and the desperate efforts he made to escape this Gehenna were as useless as those of a man trying to get out of the nightmare where he is sinking. But the necrophori had smelt out their prey, and the talitidre, sandhoppers, already surrounded him, jumping like particles of frying fat. Others came up in procession. From the dark sand, embossed by the waves, came little pale heads which seemed to sniff the wind, and soon a shellfish hoisted itself out of its hole and hastened painfully, clawing the ground and waving its sucker towards this dying prey. Pusgreen crabs came up sideways, snapping their curved pincers and squinting frightfully, followed by the hermit crabs, overwhelmed by the weight of their houses, seeming to drag themselves along on their knees. Gulls, kittiwakes and terns flew squalling over Sturly, waiting until he had ceased to move, to flock to the quarry. But still he gave signs of life. His eyes were sullied with burning sand, and a dreadful vertigo made him vibrate like a bowstring. Little by little, his comprehension of things seemed to turn to the past, to fly far away, rising and falling, always following the events of his life backwards. Memories lighted up for an instant, and then plunged into denser and denser shadow. There was a monochord agony in him, ringing through him as in an empty shell. The flowing of the spring seemed to him to make the thunderous clamour of a cataract, and it made him suffer extremely. The mucus which anointed his body stiffened him as it dried like starch, and it seemed to him that he was bound turn by turn from tail to snout by a red-hot steel cord. His soiled fins ceased to move, and his gills seemed stuck down. There was a progressive numbing of his flesh, but a wild tumult of the soul, swarms of whirling thoughts assailed him. No doubt it was a mysterious necessity, willed by God, that at this hour his whole existence should appear to him in brilliant images. Yes, he saw his life again, complete, bathed in light. But behind it there was something else, other images, those of former lives perhaps, and, as death little by little put him to sleep, a more and more beautiful light grew in him progressively, and he understood that the meaning of life is to live again after death. Now the little spring beside his ear said divine things which he hearkened to in ecstasy, and as his flesh grew cold, his sleeping soul awoke and went towards the true life. He thought radiantly, "It is a singing water which comes from the snowy rocks above there." And the spring said, "I am as pure as the first water God created by blowing on his palm to sprinkle and bless the earth with it. I am purity, Sturly, and yet I resolutely throw myself into the sea in the eternal labour of regeneration." "Why?" gasped Sturly. "O spring, O you so pure!" "To receive seeds and bear them towards life. But a time will come when I shall be drawn up by the breath of God and fly once more through the sky to condense into pure water. And thus it is with souls, Sturly." And for the last time the voice resounded once more. "Wanderer! You will still wander, my son, and this is only one of your stages. Nothing begins here below, nothing ends here, and everything continues eternally like the movement of the stars. If human beings knew what is veiled by the terror of death, where would they find courage to live? We only die in time and space, but we do not die in God. Now that you are there, do you understand how absurd it is to imagine that life can have death as its end? You sought the secret among all the treasures piled up in the depths of the great sea. It was in yourself. How could you have known it? If men knew it, if they had the proof of successive survivals, the earth would become a slaughterhouse, for everyone would wish to die to hasten the cycle of his reincarnations, each one of which brings us nearer to God." The voice of old Echinus sounded pure in the divine calm of the evening. The storm was far away, and the sun sank in the serenity of a calm twilight. But for Sturly, there was no more earth and no more sea, no more light and no more darkness. There was only a soul fulfilled. 34. The tread of a man made the sand sweat, heaped up the weeds brought by the tempest, which looked like sticky thongs cut out of black oilcloth. They were 2 fine, strong, muscular legs. The big toe separately left its imprint, and as it went forward, bent, threw back the damp sand like drops of mud. Suddenly they stopped, fixed on their heels before a swarm of insects. The man's son followed him, dragging a branch which scratched up the sand. He said, "Oh!" The father, with his branch, drove away the sandhoppers and the crabs, and said to the child, "Go and get the wheelbarrow. Lord, what a dish!" Then he sat down to watch his prize, threw away a dead sea urchin which the water had rolled there, and added, "Hurry up, we'll go and sell this fellow in the market." The end.